Welcome back. Tonight, the darkness shifts to Nottingham Castle, where whispers twist through the stones and secrets move in shadows. This chapter takes us inside the mind of the sheriff, a man both charming and terrifying, and introduces a figure who's somehow even more unsettling. It's eerie, rich with atmosphere, and full of bad omens. So get comfortable. This one slips under your skin. Chapter 4. Nottingham Castle stood tall and grim and silent, dominating the surrounding city like a spider brooding over its web. The castle had been built as a fortress to guard and oversee the northern trade routes, and its origin was clear in the dour and forbidding face it showed to the world. Gray stone walls towered up into the night, shimmering coldly in the moonlight, and strange lights shone at the narrow windows. Nottingham Castle was not a comfortable place to stay or visit, and never had been. While it was being built, the foundation stones had been splashed with the blood of Saxon slaves as they died beneath the headsman's axe, so that their ghosts would be tied to the site, and their strength would support the walls for all eternity. Of course, that was only a legend, and one liable to earn the teller a beating or a cropped ear if overheard by anyone in authority. But everyone knew. Those who lived in the city of Nottingham turned their faces away from the castle and made the sign against evil if its name came up in conversation. The only thing more feared than the castle was the man who lived in it and held power over both castle and city, the Sheriff of Nottingham. Some of this was in Sir Guy of Gisborne's mind as he strode down the silent, deserted corridor that led to the sheriff's private quarters. The sheriff did not look kindly on the bearers of ill tidings, but he had to know that Robin of Locksley had returned. The old lord had been a popular and much respected figure, and there were many who still refused to believe the charges brought against him. If Robin of Locksley were to rally them to his cause and go searching for the truth, a great many things might be dragged out into the open that would not bear the light of day. Gisborne rounded the final corner and glared at the armed guard standing before the heavy wooden door. The guard bowed respectfully, but made no move to lower his halberd or stand aside. "Move away, fool," Gisborne growled brusquely. "I have business with the sheriff." "Your pardon, Sir Guy," said the guard, still respectfully. "But Lord Nottingham has given orders that he is not to be disturbed." Gisborne hit him with a mailed fist, well below the belt, and pushed the guard aside as he collapsed. He opened the door without knocking and stepped inside, his nostrils flaring at the heavy scent of perfume and incense that permeated the sheriff's chambers. He closed the door carefully, stepped forward and bowed formally to the figure seated before him. The Sheriff of Nottingham was a tall, slender man in his early 30s, with sharp features and cold, dark eyes. The face was handsome in a brutal, unyielding way, and the faint smile that played around his mouth held little warmth and less humor. He dressed always in the finest silks and wore them with a casual elegance that was only a little studied. He sat in his chair as though it were a throne, and at his feet crouched a half-naked girl. The sheriff casually stroked her bare shoulders as he studied Gisborne, and the girl trembled uncontrollably under his touch, like a pet dog expecting punishment. The sheriff looked Gisborne up and down, taking in his battered and travel-stained appearance, and finally raised a single, elegant eyebrow. "Well, cousin, I trust you can justify this intrusion. I'd hate to think you interrupted my pleasures for anything less than the most vital emergency. For your sake. I met a hooded man today, said Gisborne, meeting the sheriff's gaze unflinchingly. He bade me warn you not to harm his people. The sheriff looked down at the girl by his feet. She'd begun to pull her tattered clothes around her to cover her nakedness, but froze when she felt his gaze upon her. She slowly raised her eyes to meet his and trembled again as he spoke. Who bade you cover up? Asked the sheriff in a calm, reasonable tone, and the girl pulled her clothes away again with quick, almost frantic movements. The sheriff turned back to Gisborne. This hooded man, does he have a name? Robin, said Gisborne. Robin of Locksley. The sheriff smiled slowly. So, the prodigal son returns. How unfortunate for him. He's nothing but a whelp guy. This girl could best him. This whelp bested 4 of my men in the blink of an eye. Your men were probably drunk. I noticed that you survived unhurt, cousin. Gisborne flushed angrily, but was careful to keep his tone neutral. I barely escaped with my life. Locksley has a companion, a dark-skinned foreigner with the marked skin of Islam. He proved himself quite deadly with a Saracen sword. In the wall behind the sheriff's chair, unnoticed by either man, a single burning eye studied the scene through a concealed spy hole, and then abruptly disappeared. The sheriff sighed heavily and cut off Gisborne's account with a casual wave of his hand. Yes, I'm sure you would have needed a whole army to fight off these 2 rogues. Desperate men, clearly. He stopped and smiled thoughtfully. I trust young Locksley has visited his old family manor by now and found the home fires still burning. He chuckled happily, ignoring the growing storm clouds in Gisborne's face, and then he sat forward suddenly as a hidden bell tinkled ominously. It only rang for a moment, but the sheriff was on his feet before the echoes had a chance to die away. He grinned broadly at Gisborne. Time for portents, cousin. Gisborne waited till the sheriff had switched his attention to the girl at his feet, and then he rolled his eyes disgustedly. The sheriff took the girl's hand in his and raised it to his mouth as though to kiss it. Her eyes were wide, and her mouth trembled piteously, but she didn't dare pull back. The sheriff pressed the shaking palm to his mouth, and then bit down hard. The girl screamed, as much at the blood running down her arm as at the sudden pain. The sheriff dropped her hand and licked her blood from his lips. Tonight, my dear, I will teach you that pleasure and pain can be one and the same. He laughed softly and then turned and left the room, knowing the girl would still be there when he returned. She could not escape, and after all, some pleasures were all the better for a little anticipation. Gisborne followed the sheriff down a long circular stairway as it wound into the dark bowels of the castle. He held his lantern high to spread the light as far as possible, but still the darkness pressed in close around them like a living, threatening presence. The sheriff seemed quite unmoved by the gloom and was actually humming pleasantly to himself as they descended the stairs. Gisborne scowled unhappily and kept his free hand near his sword. His cousin had brought him this way before, in search of unearthly knowledge and advice, but it was not a journey he would have cared to make alone. Rats moved unseen in the dark, and other things, and the person who lived in these depths by preference was no friend of his. His foot slipped on the worn-down stone of the steps, and he cursed under his breath. "Did you speak, cousin?" asked the sheriff lightly. "Since you ask, cousin, I'll say it's madness to consult the hag on these matters." The sheriff chuckled. "Fear not, dear cousin. In madness there is great power." Gisborne said nothing, and the sheriff chuckled again. All too soon the stairs came to an end, and the sheriff led Gisborne down a long, narrow corridor to a bare wooden door. Gisborne looked briefly at the blasphemous designs carved into the wood of the door, and then looked away. The sheriff produced a heavy brass key from a hidden pocket and turned it awkwardly in the massive lock. He pushed the heavy door inward, and light spilled out into the corridor. It was a pale, unhealthy light, and Gisborne hesitated a moment before following the sheriff in and closing the door behind them. It was a long room, the far end hidden in gloom and shadows. Alchemical instruments covered a sagging table, and potions dripped and bubbled in long, slender glassware and pewter bowls. There was no other furniture, only dirty straw scattered across the floor. The place stank of filth and decay and burning chemicals. Gisborne put his lantern down carefully on the floor beside him, without first blowing it out. He took comfort from its clean and natural light. The room's only illumination came from a dozen black candles and a single glowing brazier. The sheriff cleared his throat and addressed the dark shadows at the rear of the chamber. "Mortiana, I've come for a reading." Strange sounds answered him, drifting out of the darkness, harsh and unearthly. The shadows seemed to stir and grow, as though the name itself had power over them. A sudden cackle cut the air, and a wrinkled, monkey-like figure came dancing and spinning out of the shadows. Her milk-white skin and hair seemed almost to glow in the gloom, and she danced with a grace that belied her twisted form and many years. Sweat beaded on Gisborne's forehead, and he clenched his hands into fists. It was the same dance she'd performed before the Standing Stones, on the night they'd been discovered by Locksley. Why should she repeat it now? She couldn't know about young Locksley returning. It wasn't possible. The albino crone spun to a halt before Gisborne and the sheriff and smiled knowingly at them. She could have been any age, from 40 to 100. Her flesh was heavily lined and wrinkled, but her whole body blazed with unnatural energy. She dressed in the rags of what had once been a fashionable gown and wore a grisly necklace of dried chicken feet. The sheriff cleared his throat again, and the blood-red eyes darted to him. "You called Mortiana," said the sheriff patiently. "Do you have something to tell me?" The crone smiled and scuttled over to one end of the table. She brushed glass and pewter aside, regardless of whether they were in use or not, and set a bare platter before her. She glanced back over her shoulder at the two men, her head cocked slightly on one side, like a watchful bird of prey. The sheriff joined her at the table, with Gisborne hanging back as much as he dared. The crone gestured quickly with one hand and produced a large goose egg, apparently out of nowhere. She rolled it around in her hand for a moment, and then tore the egg apart with her fingers. A foul mixture of blood and albumin splashed onto the platter before her. Gisborne recoiled in disgust. "Good Christ, cousin!" "Quiet!" snapped the sheriff, not taking his eyes off the crone. "Don't use that name here. Watch and learn." Mortiana grinned at them both and shook the contents of a small leather pouch out over the bloody platter. Carved wooden runes danced in the blood as the crone rattled the platter, watching the patterns they formed with burning eyes. Her gaze grew vague and fey, and froth bubbled at the corners of her mouth as words struggled to force their way past her lips. The sheriff pressed in close, hanging on every word, trying to share the visions that passed before her unseeing eyes. He had visited Mortiana many times, and her rituals held no terror for him. He had done worse in his time, and would again if he found it necessary. He studied Mortiana's contorted face with the avid concentration of a connoisseur, frowning over every word she hissed. "I see the son of a dead man." "Does he affect us?" asked the sheriff carefully. "He precedes the lion heart." The sheriff scowled and exchanged a glance with Gisborne. "King Richard returns from the Crusades?" "That would soften the spines of the barons, just when we need it least. Does he come soon, Mortiana?" The crone swirled the platter, and the runes danced in the viscous blood. "You must make haste." "But my plan is still intact." Gisborne looked skeptically at the bloody mess on the platter and wrinkled his nose. Mortiana saw it and snarled soundlessly. She leaned over the platter, and a rune splashed into the blood, apparently from nowhere. It floated on its own, a death's head symbol. Mortiana recoiled, howling in horror, and slapped the platter to one side, sending it crashing to the floor. She whirled on Gisborne, seized him by the throat with one bony hand, and bent him back over the table. "Who?" she screamed, spittle flying into his face. "Who have you seen?" Gisborne struggled for words, held helpless by the intensity of her emotions. "No one. I've seen no one." "You lie." Mortiana released her hold on his throat and jumped back from the table, crouching on her haunches like an animal at bay. "What is wrong?" asked the sheriff. "Tell me." "I have seen our deaths." Mortiana whimpered and spun round and round on her heels, as though fearing an attack that might come from anywhere. "There is a painted man. He haunts my dreams, dark as the night he is, adorned with strange and foreign markings." The sheriff looked triumphantly at Gisborne, who nodded shakily. He'd told no one but the sheriff about Locksley's strange companion. There was no way the crone could have known. "Do you still think this madness, cousin?" asked the sheriff softly. "She has the power. She guided my father, and now she guides me." Mortiana clutched the sheriff's arms with trembling hands and thrust her face into his. "They threaten all. The man in the hood, the painted man, kill them both." She hugged the sheriff tightly, hiding her face against his chest. He caressed her soothingly and smiled at Gisborne. "Cousin, I put this in your hands. Prove to young Locksley that allowing you to survive was a mistake. His last mistake." Chapter 5. Stray shafts of red-gold sunlight pierced the mist-shrouded trees as dawn rose over the ruins of Locksley Castle. A few birds sang tentatively in the woods, but most of the world was quiet, still half asleep and unwilling to face the responsibilities of a new day. Robin sat beside his father's grave, staring at nothing. It wasn't much of a grave, just a low mound of earth with a cross fashioned from 2 sticks lashed together. The Lord of Locksley deserved better. But then he'd deserved a better death too. Robin sat listlessly, the same thoughts running through his mind over and over, unable to settle. His father was dead. The castle lay in ruins. His lands and heritage were forfeit. Every reason he'd had for coming home, every reason for surviving in the dungeons under Jerusalem, had been taken from him. In his hands he held the Locksley medallion, and he turned it over and over without looking at it, as though somehow it might suggest an answer, a reason to go on living. Duncan and Azim stood together, not far away, talking in lowered voices. They seemed to be worried about something, but Robin couldn't raise enough interest to care what. In the end, Azim turned away to gather their few belongings together, and Duncan stumbled toward Robin, tapping at the ground with his staff. Robin heard him coming, but didn't look round. At the last moment he raised an arm to stop Duncan treading unknowingly on his master's grave, and Duncan seized his hand gratefully. "He loved you to the end, young master," said Duncan. "Never doubt it. He never gave up hope that one day you would return." Robin stared at the crude cross on his father's grave and spoke to that rather than Duncan. The last words we ever shared were spoken in anger. He called the Crusades a foolish quest. I accused him of killing my mother. Duncan squeezed Robin's hand tightly, but didn't interrupt. They both knew there were things that needed to be said. Robin took a deep breath and let it out again. "I said terrible things. I was angry. I wanted to hurt him. And now, too late, I wish to take it back. Forgive me, father, please." "He does, young master," said Duncan firmly, "but you have grieved enough for him. Now, it is time to think of yourself. You must flee, head north to safety. You have cousins there who will take you in. You cannot stay here. Gisborne will surely seek revenge against you and your companion. Rest until you have been avenged. I swear it upon my honor and upon my blood." He slashed deliberately at his palm, and blood splashed down onto the grave. Azim hurried forward when Robin drew the knife, but stopped when he realized there was no immediate danger. Robin looked at him steadily. "My world has been turned upside down, Azim, but it's still my world. This isn't your fight. Go home." Azim sighed and looked away at the horizon. "If I leave you alone now, my friend, you will only get yourself killed." He looked back at Robin, and each saw loss and suffering in the other's eyes. Azim put out his hand, and Robin shook it. Blood welled from their grip and fell to the ground, an unspoken pact of death and violence and justice, come what may. And then they shouldered their packs, took Duncan by the arms, and started off down the trail that would lead, eventually, to Nottingham. It started to rain soon after, and the earth turned to mud that sucked at their feet. Dark clouds blocked out the sun, and the driving rain soaked them to the skin. Visibility shrank to a few yards, and the world became a place of looming trees and indistinct shadows. They pressed on through the storm, the gusting wind chilling them to the bone. They were far from the nearest village or hamlet, but from time to time they chanced across the burned-out shell of some house or barn. Robin had heard tales of harsh treatment handed out by the sheriff's men to those who would not or could not pay their taxes, but he dismissed most of them as rumor or exaggeration. But the farther north he traveled, the more signs he saw of devastation and unrest, until it seemed to him that he was traveling through an occupied country, a people under siege. The three of them stopped at a crossroads to check for directions, and stared silently at the rotting corpse hanging from a gibbet. Duncan stood patiently between Robin and Azim as they stared at the dead man, and he shivered violently from the cold and the rain. Robin took off his hooded cloak and wrapped it round the old man. "No, my lord," said Duncan, shocked. "I cannot be warm while you are cold. It is not proper." Robin smiled briefly. "New rules, old friend. There are no rules for woodsmen such as us." They walked on a while in silence, heads bowed to keep the rain out of their faces, until Azim growled something under his breath in his own tongue. Robin looked at him inquiringly, and Azim sniffed loudly. "Never have I witnessed a storm of such duration and determination. When does summer come to this land?" Robin chuckled in spite of himself. "This is summer." Azim gave him a hard look and shook his head slowly, and they trudged on through the wind and the rain. The storm gradually died away over the next hour, but the day stayed cold. Robin's spirits finally rose a little when he spotted smoke curling up into the sky beyond a narrow stretch of woodland, and he increased his pace. He led the way down a rough, winding path that brought them to an old dry stone wall. Beyond the wall stood a large, blocky mansion with a thatched roof. Robin nodded slowly to himself and relaxed a little. It had been a long time since he'd visited Dubois Mansion, and he hadn't been sure he remembered the way. He often played at the mansion as a child, but that was all of 20 years ago. The place looked a lot smaller than he remembered it, but then it would. "What is this place?" asked Azim. "Peter's house," said Robin. "I swore an oath to him, remember? It's 6 years or more since he left here to come with me on a glorious adventure to the Holy Lands. Now I've returned without him. Still, we should find food and shelter here." "And dry clothes?" asked Azim. "I don't see why not," said Robin. "The Dubois family and the Loxleys have been firm friends for generations." He found the gate in the wall and led the way to the impressively large front door. He knocked politely, waited a while, and then pounded on the door with his fist. There was a long pause, and then a hatch slid open in the top half of the door, revealing the face of what had to be the oldest woman Robin had ever seen. He put on his best polite smile. "No more beggars," snapped the old woman, and she slammed the hatch shut. Robin blinked and then hammered determinedly on the door again. The hatch slammed open, and the scowling face reappeared. "We are not beggars," said Robin quickly. "Tell the mistress of the house that Robin Loxley is at her door." "Can't," said the old woman. "Her ladyship isn't here." Robin smiled doggedly, ignoring the looks on his companions' faces. "Very well. In that case, is the child Marian at home?" "Maybe she is," said the old woman, "and maybe she isn't." She went to slam the hatch shut again. Robin thrust his hand into the gap to stop her. The old woman slammed the hatch anyway. Robin howled and jerked his crushed fingers free. The hatch slammed shut. Robin tucked his throbbing hand into his armpit and performed a little stamping dance of pain and anguish, while Azim looked on interestedly. "It seems hospitality in your country is as warm as the weather," he observed. Robin gave him a hard look and then glared at the closed door. He was wet and cold and tired, and had half a mind to bum the whole place down on general principles. Reluctantly, he turned away. They couldn't afford to draw attention to themselves. He gestured for Azim to help Tom Duncan around so they could leave. And then he stopped and looked back as he heard the sound of bolts being withdrawn from their sockets. The door opened a crack. There was a brief pause, and then the old woman cleared her throat unhappily. "Leave your weapons." The three of them started forward. Robin began a graceful speech of thanks. The door opened just wide enough for the old woman to point a bony finger at Robin. "Just you, not them." Robin started to protest angrily and then stopped himself. Azim, and particularly Duncan, needed warmth and shelter, but he obviously wasn't going to get any further with the old woman. She acted as though she were half-guard dog. Looked it too, for that matter. His best bet was to wait and talk to whoever was in charge, and hope he could persuade them of his good intentions. He unbuckled his sword belt and handed it to the Moor, squeezed Duncan's arm reassuringly, and stepped through the narrow gap into the gloomy hall beyond. The door slammed shut again, and inside, bolts crashed back into their sockets. Azim shook his head slowly and hung Robin's sword belt securely from his shoulder. Duncan shivered and pouted and kicked at the muddy ground. "A pox on all Moors and Saracens," he shouted suddenly. "Were it not for their ungodly ways, Master Robin would never have gone off and left us, and none of this would be happening. Never been treated this way in my life." He muttered rebelliously to himself for a while, and then remembered there was someone else with him. He turned his head vaguely in Azim's direction and tried to think of something to say. Polite conversation had never been one of his strong points. "Azim, tell me, what manner of name is that? Irish, perhaps? Comish?" "Close," said Azim. "It's Moorish." The expression of sheer horror that crept over Duncan's face at that point did much to compensate Azim for the day so far. Inside Dubois Mansion, the old woman led Robin into the main hall, told him to wait there and not touch anything, gave him a last suspicious glare, and then stomped off and disappeared up the stairs at the end of the hall. Robin looked around him and tried to squeeze some of the excess water out of his clothes and hair. It was a fair-sized hall, dominated by the long dining table and the usual collection of deer and boar heads mounted on the walls. Robin remembered them from his childhood visits. He'd never liked them. He'd been convinced the eyes moved to follow him whenever he wasn't looking. On the wall facing the stuffed and mounted heads was the usual collection of ancestral portraits, most of the subjects looking as though they'd been in a really filthy mood when they'd had their portraits painted. Robin had never cared much for them either. He heard quiet creaking sounds from the balcony above him and looked quickly up to see who was there. He felt obscurely guilty, as though whoever it was knew what he'd been thinking. A dim figure looked down at him, half obscured by shadows. "Who are you?" said a woman's voice. Robin gave her his most charming smile. "My apologies for this intrusion. I am Robin of Locksley." "You lie," said the woman flatly. "Robin is dead. Step more into the light so that I can see your face. Now tum around." Robin did so, still smiling determinedly. "What would you like me to do now? Dance a few steps? Who are you?" "I am the maid Marian," said the figure haughtily. "Then show yourself, child," said Robin. "You have nothing to fear from me. We knew each other well when we were younger." The woman stepped forward into the light, and Robin had to fight down a strong impulse to take several steps backward. It was possible that somewhere in his many travels, he might have met a fatter and uglier woman than the one looking down at him, but he was damned if he could remember it. The last time he'd seen a face like that, it had been sneering down at him from a cathedral roof. "Marian," said Robin, hanging on to his smile, but only just. "The years have been kind. You haven't changed at all." "Thank you." She smiled down at Robin. At least, he thought it was meant to be a smile. She remembered who he was, and the smile vanished. With the king away, we must always be on guard against outlaws, and as relatives of the king, we must beware of kidnappers in these lawless times. So you have spoken to me as you wished. Now remove yourself from this household." "I would, my lady," said Robin graciously, "but I am sworn to protect you." She laughed dismissively. Protect me? Robin of Locksley was never anything but a spoiled bully. Robin tensed suddenly as he heard soft footsteps behind him, but before he could tum around a sword point, jabbed him firmly in the back He raised his hands slowly to show they were both empty and peered carefully back over his shoulder. Holding the sword at his back was a man dressed all in black, face hidden behind a metal fighting mask. "As you can see," came the voice from above, "we are already well protected. Now, leave." "Wait, Marion. Let me explain." Robin broke off as the sword point jabbed him meaningfully in the back, at which time Robin decided very firmly that he'd put up with enough for one day. He spun round to face his assailant, hand dropping automatically to where his sword should have been, and glared at the figure before him. "You are truly courageous when set against an unarmed man. What do you do when you're feeling really brave? Sneak up on them in the dark, when they're fast asleep." The figure gestured at the door with his sword. The moment the blade moved away from him, Robin kicked the masked man under the knee. He stumbled backward, caught off balance, and Robin slapped the sword out of his hand. It fell on the floor between them. Robin reached down for it, and the masked man quickly kicked it out of reach. He then drew a dagger from a concealed sheath, and Robin backed quickly away. There were only 2 exits from the hall, and the masked man was in the perfect position to block the way to both of them. He pressed forward, dagger at the ready. Robin turned and ran to the nearest wall. The masked man started after him, and then stopped as Robin turned back with an antlered deer head he'd torn from the wall. They faced each other over the horns for a moment, and then the masked man stepped forward and chopped viciously at the antlers with his dagger. The solid steel hacked through the antlers as though they were straw. Outside the mansion, Azim and Duncan looked round sharply as the sound of fighting came to them. Azim hurled himself at the door. It shuddered under his weight, but didn't yield. Azim hit it again, grunting with the effort. Duncan glared sightlessly about him, brandishing his stick fiercely. "Point me towards danger, Azim. I'm ready for them." Azim shook his head and slammed his shoulder against the door again and again. Back in the main hall, chunks of antler flew on the air as the masked man forced Robin to retreat with a whirlwind attack. He parried and thrust with the antlers as best he could, but they were quickly being whittled away by the dagger. Finally, left with nothing but the nubs, Robin hurled the deer head at his assailant and threw himself after it. He managed to grab the hand holding the dagger, spun his assailant round, and smashed the hand against the wall until the dagger fell from numbed fingers. They struggled together, and Robin quickly realized he was by far the stronger. He waded into his assailant with both fists, and the masked man collapsed. Robin stood over him for a moment, panting for breath, and then reached down and tore off the metal mask. Long hair tumbled free, and Robin stared blankly at the beautiful woman glaring up at him. The door flew open and Azim burst in, scimitar at the ready. Robin looked round, startled, and the woman seized the opportunity to punch him viciously in the groin. Robin sank to his knees beside her and smiled with clenched teeth. "Hello, Marion." Sometime later, when everyone had recovered somewhat, Robin and Marion walked together in the open yard before Dubois Mansion. Marion stared numbly at the ring Robin handed her, the insignia ring Peter had given him in a Jerusalem back street. Robin looked away to allow her a little privacy as the news of her brother's death sank in. Rock-strewn hills surrounded the mansion on both sides, dotted here and there with grazing sheep. The rain had stopped, and sunlight was peeking through the clouds. Marion saw none of it, her gaze fixed on the ring in her hand, her mind in a Jerusalem street she'd never seen. "You are sure?" she said finally. "You are sure he's dead?" "Yes," said Robin gently. "He fought bravely, right to the end." Marian looked at him almost challengingly, anger and anguish fighting in her voice. "Why would my brother wish me to be protected by the boy who set fire to my hair when I was a child?" "Because he knew that years of war and prison can change a man." Marian tried to answer him, but anguish choked her voice. Robin started to put an arm round her shoulders, but stopped when she tensed at his touch. He took his arm away, and Marian dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, refusing to give in to tears. "I will forward your condolences to my mother in London," Marian said grimly. "I would think you'd be safer with her." "I have no interest in life at court, gossip-mongering and currying favor," she scoffed. "You're alone, then?" "Hardly." Marian gestured at the ragged peasants crowding around the mansion's kitchen door for the simple food that was all the mansion had to offer. The peasants looked beaten down and badly malnourished and carried their few possessions on their backs, like refugees from a war. Bones protruded from sunken faces, and silent children stared about them with frightened, hollow eyes. Anger brought the color back to Marian's face as she watched them. "These times have brought me many mouths to feed. While you and my brother were off playing boy heroes, the sheriff of Nottingham has plundered the county." She glared at Robin as though it were all his fault. He met her gaze steadily, just about holding on to his temper. "Yet you still have your land and your property, Marian. Why is that?" "Because I give the sheriff no excuse to take them," snapped Marian. "I keep my mouth shut and I don't make trouble. What else can I do? If I was gone, who would feed these people? I am the king's cousin. It's my duty to help these people until he returns and puts things to rights again." They looked at each other for a long moment, pain and despair driving the anger from their eyes. Robin looked away first. "Marian, why did the sheriff kill my father and destroy my home?" "Because he can." Marian's voice softened, and she put a gentle hand on his arm. "Robin, don't believe for a moment the accusations they made against your father, even if you did despise him." Robin smiled sadly, still looking out at the gray-green hills. "When I was 11, after my mother died, my father loved a peasant woman. I hated him for it, even after it ended, saying he'd betrayed my mother. So, when I came of age, I joined the holy quest and sailed for the East, seeking purification and perfection through adventure in a righteous cause. Instead, I found only blood and horror, and learned there are no perfect men in this world, only perfect intentions." Marian studied Robin as he stood, lost in old memories and present pain. This wasn't the Robin she remembered. There was sadness and hard use in his face, but there was strength too. "What are your intentions now, Robin?" "To set things right," said Robin, and there were no doubts or misgivings in his voice, only a harsh, implacable certainty. Marian looked off at the horizon, and she seemed suddenly weary and frustrated. "More bloodshed. I'm tired of heroic boyish gestures. I'm tired of boys." She looked back at Robin and smiled sadly. "Don't do anything foolish, Robin. These are dangerous times." "Then times must change," said Robin. They both looked round sharply as Azim called urgently to Robin from atop the estate wall. The Moor was looking out across the countryside and scowling thoughtfully. Robin hurried over to the wall and climbed up beside Azim. Down in the valley, a thick plume of dust was heading toward Dubois Mansion. Robin frowned, That much dust had to mean a fairly large group of horsemen, and it was too much to hope that their arrival during his visit was a coincidence. Someone must have recognized him earlier on and sent word to the sheriff. He turned to Azim for advice and then stopped, mystified, as the Moor opened the pouch at his belt and produced 2 circles of ground glass and a square of leather hide. Azim rolled the hide into a tube, stuck a glass into each end, and then raised the primitive telescope to his eye. Robin watched curiously. He'd just about decided it must be something to do with the Moor's religion, when Azim handed him the contraption and told him to look through it. Robin hefted the leather tube dubiously, gave Azim a hard look, just in case this was some obscure Arabic joke, and then gingerly put the telescope to his eye. Armed soldiers on horseback appeared before him, charging straight at him. Robin almost dropped the telescope and grabbed at his sword to defend himself, at which point he realized there was no longer any sign of the soldiers, apart from the plume of dust down in the valley. A delighted smile spread slowly across Robin's face as he realized what the telescope had shown him. He looked at the leather tube with awe. A wondrous mechanism, Azim. The Moor shook his head slowly. How did your uneducated kind ever take Jerusalem? Robin smiled. God knows. He looked through the telescope again and scowled as it showed him Gisborne riding at the head of the soldiers. What is it? Called Marian impatiently. What do you see? The sheriff's soldiers, said Robin. Coming here? Is this your idea of protection? Robin and Azim leapt down from the wall. They shared a quick glance, and then Azim ran for the stables, while Robin went back to talk to Marian. I killed some of the sheriff's men, he said steadily. The cause was just, but I doubt I could convince the sheriff of that. I fear I've placed you in danger by coming here. I can take care of myself, said Marian coolly. Now get out of here and take your friends with you, while you still can. Azim reappeared with Duncan in tow and 2 saddleless horses. Robin winced. He hated riding bareback. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drifted up from the valley, drawing steadily closer. Robin hesitated, looking from Marian to his friends and back again. I told you I was sworn to protect you, Marian. And I told you, no more boyish gestures. Robin shook his head firmly. I'm not leaving. You need me. Marian glared at him. Robin folded his arms across his chest and glared stubbornly back, at which point the yard's gate burst open and mounted soldiers spilled into the yard, with Gisborne at their head, scattering the peasants like frightened quail. Marian pointed dramatically at Robin. Stop these men, she yelled loudly. They're stealing my horses. Damn the girl, said Robin admiringly, and ran for the waiting horses. Azim leapt onto one, hoisted Duncan up behind him, and dug in his heels. The horse thundered toward the gate, followed by its companion. Robin leapt aboard the second horse while it was still moving, made a rude gesture at Gisborne, and headed for the gate at full speed. A soldier slammed the gate shut, blocking their way. Robin and Azim shared a quick glance, and then dug their heels in again. The 2 horses jumped the gate as though they did it every day, and raced on without slowing. Crossbow bolts filled the air around them. Gisborne swung his horse round to follow them, and found Marian standing directly in his path. He glared down at her, all but frothing at the mouth. You have been sheltering woodsmen, Marian. They're thieves, you imbecile, said Marian, glaring fought back at him. Bring back my horses, or the sheriff will hear of your cowardice." Gisborne smiled coldly. He knew she was lying. He also knew he couldn't prove it. "You're lucky he didn't steal our virtue too, Marion. Assuming you still have it to lose, of course." He turned his back on her and bellowed at his men. "A crown to the man who brings me Locksley's head, and someone get that bloody gate open." Robin urged his horse on and tried hard to think of somewhere intelligent to head for. There was nowhere to hide in the valley, and the hills were too steep and too rocky for the horses to manage. And up ahead lay mile after mile of open moorland. Robin racked his brain frantically for a way out of the trap he'd made for himself, but it didn't take him long to realize the only hope he had left was to try and outrun his pursuers. A narrow stream appeared before them, and Robin hung on grimly as his horse charged through the frothing waters without slowing. He glanced back to make sure Azim was still keeping up, and was relieved to find the moor right behind him, with Duncan clinging onto him for dear life. Robin almost smiled, but the sight just reminded him that Azim's horse was carrying 2 riders, and there was a limit to how long the animal could maintain such a pace while carrying that kind of weight. They thundered on, and the open land turned to scrub. The land rushed by in a verdant blur, and Robin glared about him, trying to get his bearings. Off in the distance, a hill rose up into the sky, half its face taken up with a huge Neolithic horse carved into the chalk. A sudden chill ran down Robin's spine. If he was where he thought he was, there might be a chance after all. It wasn't a way out he would have chosen, and the sanctuary he had in mind might come out to be worse than what lay behind them. But any port in a storm, he brought his horse to a halt, and Azim followed suit. "Any chance we've lost them?" asked Robin breathlessly. The Moor reassembled his telescope and looked back the way they'd come. Less than half a mile behind, Gisborne was fanning his men out to encircle his prey. Azim lowered the telescope and looked grimly at Robin. "They're closing. My horse carries 2, and yours is growing lame. We cannot outrun them." "Leave me, Master Robin," said Duncan, struggling to get his breath after the punishing ride. "Tom just slowing your escape." Robin ignored him and pointed at the mass of trees on the skyline. "One chance, Azim. We'll lose them in the forest." "No, Master Robin." Duncan turned his blind gaze in Robin's direction, his face a mask of horror. "Sherwood is haunted. We put our souls at risk just passing by it." Robin shrugged quickly. "Either we take our chances with the spirits, or we'll end up ghosts ourselves." They raced for the trees, which spread out into an apparently endless expanse as they drew nearer to the forest. Robin glanced back over his shoulder. Gisborne had seen where they were heading and was signaling for his men to cut them off. Robin grinned as he saw some of the men hesitate. They didn't like Sherwood either. He looked back at the forest before him. Gnarled and grotesque trees loomed up ahead, and beyond them, a seemingly solid wall of dark, forbidding growth. Robin could feel the hackles rising on the back of his neck. He gritted his teeth and plunged into the enveloping night of the forest, followed by Azim and Duncan. Gisborne's men thundered to a halt at the edge of Sherwood and disintegrated into a confused, milling mob of white-faced men and snorting horses. The soldiers peered in open trepidation at the deep shadows and the twisted trees and muttered unhappily to each other. Gisborne glared at them furiously, and they wouldn't meet his eyes. "What's the matter, damn you? There are only 3 of them." "It's not the men we fear," muttered a soldier at the back. Gisborne cursed them all for fools and cowards and traitors, but not one man would cross the boundary into Sherwood Forest. Frustrated, Gisborne turned to face the trees and shouted at the mocking shadows. "Robin of the Hood, son of the devil worshipper." Some distance into the forest, Robin and Azim and Duncan sat quietly on their horses in the gloom, listening. "Your father died a coward," yelled Gisborne, grinning madly. "He cursed your name and squealed like a stuck pig." "That's a lie." Robin made as though to urge his horse back out of the gloom, but Azim stopped him with a hand on his Anne. "I was the one who strung his corpse from the castle wall," called Gisborne tauntingly. "It will be my pleasure to do the same to you." Robin threw off Azim's restraining hand, and the Moor grabbed at the horse's mane to hold the animal back. "You will gain no justice for your father by dying needlessly today," he hissed. "Be patient." Robin looked at him for a long moment, and then nodded reluctantly. Azim released his hold, and Robin led the way deeper into Sherwood Forest. Thanks for spending some time with me tonight. I hope I helped you unwind and drift a little closer to sleep. If you're enjoying these readings, there's a whole library of full books and cozy chapters waiting for you over on my Patreon. If you are already a member, then I thank you. It includes exclusive content, bonus episodes, and early access to new releases. You can also become a YouTube member, if you haven't already, to listen ad-free and explore over 280 relaxing readings anytime you like. I'd love to have you there. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next one.